Wanted to call the meeting of the Corte Madera Flood Board to order. Anybody from the audience that wants to speak on any item not on the agenda may do so. Seeing nobody stepping forward, I just wanted to go to the approval of the meeting minutes. Did anybody have any corrections or changes?
Nope.
Okay.
Changes.
Move to approve.
Move to approve the last meeting minutes.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay, minutes approved. RJ wants to do an introduction, and
Yes.
also we need to introduce RJ as the new director of Public Works.
Thank you, sir.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So obviously excited for the opportunity. Been here for about a year and a half now since I'm transferring from County of Marin, and it's been a great community, and I just hope to be able to, serve the community better and for a much longer period, and excited for the role. And with that, also want to introduce Chris Good. He was a former colleague of mine at the County of Marin. He's got some great experience that he'll, I'm sure, tell you about, but he's been here since about June or July, and he's doing a great job so far, and so moving forward, he'll be the staff liaison to the Flood Control Board. I'll obviously still be involved in all the meetings, but yeah, figured a good time to get his feet wet and get to know all you. So yeah, Chris, you want to say a few words?
Sure. It's nice to meet you all. I grew up in Mill Valley, so I'm from around here, and went to Cal Poly, and as RJ mentioned, I worked at the County of Marin with him for 7 or 8 years. So I've got a lot of experience in Marin, and I've had some experience with flooded areas, so I'm hoping to help work towards a solution in Corte Madera.
Chris
Okay.
took on a series of big road and drainage improvement projects in Santa Venetia, which is an area that is very similar to Mariners Cove and Marina Village. So,
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Which
Thank you.
Cal Poly did you go to?
Sorry?
Which Cal Poly?
In San Luis Obispo.
All right, go Mustangs.
great. So moving on, our first and kind of main event item is a presentation item for status of the climate adaptation plan, and we have Mindy Craig from Blue Point Planning. She's going to put together a little presentation here. Let me switch PowerPoints for a second. Mindy, you prefer questions as we go, or wait to the
Please.
end? Okay.
Yeah, just chat, I think, as we go through this, definitely. Great. I
Yeah.
think this works. Yep. So yeah, it looks very familiar, doesn't it? And we're walking on water, so doesn't mean we get to solve everything. So thanks. So I'm Mindy Craig. I've definitely met at least a few of you at some of the other meetings at the RAC and at the community workshops we had earlier. I am the lead for the team on outreach as well as a planner myself. I am not a hydrologist, so some of the technical things I will not be able to answer, but we'll note those and get back to you if there's some things that don't actually come up. But this was an opportunity to come and to give you guys a quick update on what's been going on. A lot of what's happening right now, just overall, is gathering data and sort of parsing out the different how we manage thinking about this project. How do we consider data? How do we consider assets? And where we would go with strategies. So that's a lot of what we're doing right now. And then with RJ coming on, we're going to work with him and bring him both up to speed, although he's already pretty much up there, and then start to connect the dots of how we move forward in a most effective way. So we know why we're doing this. We all had a little bit of fun and games last week, PG&E, and we look here at Corte Madera, and we know that we're right there in the WUI. The bright red is the fire risk area. It's a huge issue for us on fire, but we also are here because of the flood issues that are ever present. So we're already experiencing floods during king tides. And so this adaptation plan is really an opportunity for us to take the values that the community has in terms of what's important to them, what are the priorities, and to connect those with science solutions and try to come up with ways to adapt to what's already happening. So right now we've been working on what we would call laying the foundation. So really understanding what are the problems or the concerns, both from that science base and the values. So we had the community outreach meetings, both for the fire and for the other ones. And we're continuing to have these conversations, both at technical groups and citizens groups. And then we're looking at all the different kind of strategies and options. What can we do to actually address our challenges? And time is a really big part of that question, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to the flood maps. And then refining those, understanding our priorities, how do we actually move forward with an effective plan, and then doing a final adaptation plan. And I believe that's going to be finished sometime in the kind of mid to end of next year. Is that correct, Roger?
Yeah, I mean, the whole effort, it's scheduled to be completed by the end of next year. Still see if that's all feasible. It's a lot of work to get done, but that's the goal.
Yeah. And then we have 3 major areas that we're looking at. So this is a transportation-funded project, as you all know, from Caltrans, but it's looking at a broader perspective, sea level rise and coastal flood resilience, as well as wildfire and transportation. So you do hear a lot of transportation elements because that is part of our funding. And obviously that's also a major challenge here in Corte Madera, especially with 101.
And if I
Yeah.
just to emphasize, so the funding was through a Caltrans or an ATP grant, so we do have an obligation to focus on the transportation elements, and so doesn't mean we can't also look at other parts of vulnerabilities for the townwide infrastructure, but definitely need to make sure we report on the transportation part.
Do you mind if I ask a question about that?
Sure.
One of the things that I think I was thinking in regards to that grant is that if the CHP is located on that road over by Mariner Cove, is the grant actually include the way that the CHP gets to the freeway as far as any kind of infrastructure improvement?
So I mean, when we say infrastructure, I think obviously that does mean 101, but it also means other roadway networks.
Yeah, so how far is that? Can we stretch that?
So you'll see in one of the diagrams, we are looking, one of the areas we think we can review is, San Clemente
yeah.
and parts of Paradise Drive. So
Yeah.
Okay.
there's a diagram she'll get to.
Yeah, definitely. Just since it's always just to kind of keep our mind, I mean, we don't want to be so narrow that we miss out things, and I think we can talk about how do we connect to the dots on this, but we do have our Lord of Caltrans watching us. But I want to also bring up this slide too, which is there's mitigation and there's adaptation, and again, don't want to be slicing hairs, but we know that there's a huge amount of things we're trying to do to mitigate the impacts of climate change. That's really not what we're trying to do in terms of our strategies. We're really looking at adaptation. So and there's certain, as sort of in the red there are things that are overlapping, but we're looking at how do we do things like the flood protection and the infrastructure upgrades to address what we anticipate are impacts from climate change. We're not trying to set up strategies that fight climate change at this local level. So just kind of giving that as a quick element here. So as many of you guys saw, that we had 2 good community workshops. One was on the hillside, one was on the shoreline. We asked very similar questions. We had people go and look over their maps and the information and hear us a presentation about what we were trying to do. And we did ask them, we were starting to get some of the goals and some of the vision for this and really understand what resilience means to the community. And I think these are important elements as we think about what are we going to do about this, because this idea of one town resilient together was one of the sort of overarching visions. And what that meant to us, I'd be curious what you think, is this idea that, yes, there are people who have flood issues, there are people who have fire issues, but we're one town. And so together, if we can balance our resources, balance what we're doing, how do we become resilient as a whole rather than just considering one side or the other? And then there was this idea of what does it mean to be resilient, and to create that through this planning effort, which is to live and enjoy life by limiting disruption and returning to normal quickly. And we do this through creating redundancy of services and facilities and enhancing regional collaboration paired with adequate funding for mitigation and recovery. So I think important, of course, is this enhancing regional collaboration. It's great you guys have the connections to County of Marin already, but your neighbor at Larkspur, because water doesn't care the jurisdictional boundaries. And so how do we do that? So these are just some of the things we're trying to, as this laying of the foundation, that as we get down into the nitty gritty in a few months of making choices, we use some of this as a touchstone to remember what our values are that we're choosing around. Anybody, any thoughts or questions on that before I jump ahead?
That's good.
Okay. And we have some, we'll be hopefully bringing out some of the goals that also are coming from this. We also did a survey. I'm sure that some of you had done that. We launched it at those workshops and asked people to do it. So we had about 128 total respondents. We had 16 people who had some sort of professional understanding of these issues. Everybody was from Corte Madera. Overall, people were very concerned about climate change, the impacts, and the need for immediate action. Wildfires and sea level rise were the top issues, not surprising. And that 80% of our scientists who were professionals indicated that climate change is the number one priority for Corte Madera to address. So those are kind of important things. And when do you think climate change will affect the count of Corte Madera? So right now, almost 75% people said it's happening right now. Only a slim 2% said it's not going to affect Corte Madera. And at least another 15% said within 10 years. So it's a pretty immediate concern for a lot of individuals. And then our scientists said that 79% say Corte Madera is being affected now, 21% in 10 years. So there are far fewer who thought it was going to be later. Sorry, it looks like the font's not coming through here. But the next question was, how concerned are you about the impacts of climate change on the future of humanity? So not just Corte Madera. There was a large number, 72%. 3.5% said not at all concerned. But most people are very, very concerned about what's happening. And the line here, Corte Madera is not a red state, apparently. Okay, so this might be hard to read, but one of the questions was how, on a scale of 1 to 4, how concerned are you about a various number of things? And just to sort of read through the bright red is the highest concern. So the red and the brown shows the most concern. The little blue highlight means those are not necessarily climate related. Those are disasters that can happen. So an earthquake or a cyber attack are different than climate change, although the earthquake can have some climate elements at times, but most of these things are all climate. So wildfire, sea level rise, top issues. And our scientists, the same thing, same general thing, but flooding during king tides raised much higher, and you can see a lot of the things that were not climate oriented sort of went into the second column over there as not as important to them, so they were really focusing on those climate impacts. And then we also had flooding during heavy rains and severe weather, heats and cold. And so the biggest priorities for Corte Madera to deal with is minimizing wildfire risk, dealing with climate change, and preventing flooding. So about 50% were on wildfire. And then it was more about 35% are on preventing flooding. So overall, we have a number of concerns in Corte Madera. Obviously, the coastal flooding is big, extreme precipitation. So we saw last year tons of rain. We started seeing mudslides at different locations. We've seen places like Santa Barbara who have had 100-year fires followed 2 weeks later by 100-year rains that created huge mudslides. Things are happening in ways we don't even know, and these kind of extreme things. Obviously, wildfire risk is a high one. Community support systems. So how do our electricity, water, and sewer all behave? And there's cascading impacts, as again we saw last week. We think that electricity is getting our phones and our lights on, and all of a sudden we realize, oh gosh, all my food's going to go bad. I can't get food. Huge number of things start to go with that. Transportation, already 101 has been flooding as long as I grew up here. It's always been flooding. It's not getting any better. And all of our networks getting there are a challenge. And in fires, one of the big issues in the hillside is that we have very narrow lanes for people to get in and out. That's very problematic. And then we have folks who are, we call them frontline communities, so people who are elderly, disabled, youth, who are much more susceptible to issues related to climate change that we need to consider. So just kind of moving right into your area of interest, the shoreline neighborhoods and flooding elements. So right now we're looking at different thresholds of potential and scenarios. So we've created 3 different scenarios to map and to try and understand how we're going to address those. So right now we have our scenario 1, which we get those with king tides. And these events of changes, and by 2030 we'll have an extra foot of sea level rise on a daily basis. Looking out maybe to 5 years out, and then 2060 we get to 3 feet of sea level rise. And then out further to the 70s, 2070, 2090, you get to 3.5 to 5.5 feet of sea level rise. And the years on the event are kind of a funny thing. It's more about the chance of having one of these events. It's not that we're going to have, it's going to be 100 years and then we'll get one of these and it's another 100 years. It's like that is the possibility, the probability of having it. So it means like 1 in 100, but you could have multiple 1 in 100 years right after each other, and then it might not happen for a while. So it's a little bit of a weird. Uh-oh. There we go. Back on. It's kind of an odd thing to consider, but I think if we look at the time and the height of the sea level rise, you get a better sense of that.
So on that last slide,
Yeah.
what is the source for the sea level rise? That
Adapting to rising tides is what has been used.
And so as that source changes, you'll update.
That should be. I mean, I'm sure these things are going to continue to change, and so we're obviously at a snapshot point here, and so. One of the things about using thresholds is that if our projections of time are off, if we know that we're saying, hey, at this point is when you trigger certain strategies, that doesn't depend on time. It matters on how we've reached that threshold. Does that make sense?
And that's a question I've gotten from people who know I'm on the board.
Yeah.
Is what source are you using? Is it the IPC, or is it local, or is it something that's changed, or where can we look it up? How do you know there's not a better source? So I think as far as telling the public what we're doing, I think people understanding and trusting the source of these numbers is really important.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if it shows on that flyer in front of you, the one with the blue.
Yeah.
I think it does say adapting to rising tides, and those are all online. And a community member actually can go online and look at those, and those are really recent. They have been working on it for quite a while. It's a consortium of a whole bunch of regional agencies, and there's a report, and it's interactive.
Yeah, I think it's useful to always put the source on all the literature we put out, just so people know.
Good,
and then
good
as far
point.
as the events go, is that NOAA weather data?
Good question.
I know that, for FEMA maps, the 100-year flood changed recently.
Yeah.
And as storms get larger, we might start seeing readjustments in what a 100-year flood is, and I think that would also be good to have the source for that stuff.
Yeah. I'm looking at. I'm thinking they're using 100% of what's the art stuff that is including all of those into it. So it's based on all those models. So I'm not sure what their Adapting to Rising Tides uses their weather model. So it's all one and the same.
Okay. So I just think in general, just making sure we're clear about sources is good.
Yeah, we'll be sure to add some footnotes on some of that.
Yeah. Good point. Thanks. So we have started to map out what this looks like. This is that first current flood risk point. And you can see some of the little squares are some of the community assets on there. We haven't used funny little icons. Unfortunately, I didn't bring my glasses. So the green is the school, the yellow are medical facilities, the pink is fire stations, the blue is law enforcement, and the black, thank you, are transportation elements. So you can see down here where the green is, there's a number of schools over here. You can see the school up. Let's do this. You can see one of the schools here and here. Some of the fire stations here. This is the school that has just been built where we had our meeting. And so this is what's happening basically right now with the king tides. All right.
It's worth noting, though, that this graph doesn't take into account all the levee protection systems. So it's kind of, if our flood control systems weren't fully working, the blue, right? So the blue.
Yeah, so this is the darker the blue.
Sorry.
The darker the blue, the deeper the water. So the light white is less flooding.
Right. So yeah, so I mean, there's different ways to, protect against this, but this is kind of showing if we had a breach or we had a failure in our levee system or our levees were inadequate, this is what you would expect. This is kind of the elevation of sea level rise in this event.
And some of the challenges on some of the here is that there are chances where water may not overtop here, but they could come in and they can come around. So it's not just overtopping the levees. There's places where they can come in different locations. So that's one of the things we're looking at is how and where the water goes in the different scenarios.
Is this showing a 100-year flood event?
This is just right now. So this is with 1 foot of sea level rise and king tides.
Okay.
So then here's what they're sort of talking as levee overtopping. And this is the 3 foot sea level rise. So this is looking out further. And you can see here that the water has turned to a darker blue. So it's deeper. It's more extensive. In the last slide, you didn't see the school didn't have any water near it, and now it does. And this has become much more inundated.
What's the red lines?
Overtopping.
Dikes, berms?
That's the
Overtopping line,
That's
yeah.
where it all comes over.
Yeah,
Do you mind showing the image just before this?
Yeah.
But zoomed
So-
up like that?
there we go. So yeah, this one does not have the overtopping in all those different locations, but it has it
Okay.
in a number of places.
Yeah, and then we can also put this online and distribute this.
Yeah.
And you were saying that the systems right now can handle this event, but this would be showing if all the systems failed or only one or some of the systems failed?
This is okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I mean, we don't have a detailed answer on what level of sea level rise each of our systems can handle. I mean, we have a number of systems in Corte Madera. That's certainly something we want to look at and prioritize. But obviously, we're not seeing, all these areas
Yeah.
flood right now. So we have systems in place that are currently working aside from, a couple spots where we do have king tides and we have known issues.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if the models take into account, like I know Town Center has a bunch of pumps that they've put
Right.
into place.
And I don't.
I'm not sure if that's
I don't
been.
think it does, and that's why
Yeah.
as we go through it, we'll try to
Yeah.
put in those inputs and try to understand it on a more detailed level.
Yeah, and I think this is the challenge of how do we identify and hone in on this? Is we're working with data that is challenging because things are changing, and we have to try and get to the best information possible. So this is what we've been working on, the team here. And then this is the chronic inundation. So this is going out to 5.5 feet of sea level rise, and you can see that this is in the 2070, 2090 timeframe. And you have massive inundation on a chronic basis throughout here.
You mentioned that clearly if levees, this is too high for pretty much everything, but clearly if levees are working in some areas but not in others, it can get behind them. So we need to cooperate with Larkspur, obviously. I think it would be useful for this group to look at an estimated height of sea level rise that would necessitate a continuous levee between Paradise Drive and Larkspur Landing.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, you're going to get to the point where that's the only thing that can stop water. And it would be good for the town to start thinking about how high the water would have to be for there to be no other choice but a continuous levee and pumps. It might be 6 feet higher than now, but it might be 3 feet. We just don't know that answer. And I think for long-term planning, it's something that we should at least start to look at.
Can you, Board Member Blumgren, could you clarify when you say Larkspur Landing, are you saying spanning Corte Madera Creek or just the perimeter of the creek?
You could
Or
make
without, you know.
you could make some pretty obvious protective levees, drawing a line from Paradise Drive around existing neighborhoods and along existing bike paths and dikes. What you would do when you got towards Larkspur Landing, I don't know. You could build levees all the way up Corte Madera Creek, or you could do something across.
Tide gate.
Yeah, tide gate or something.
That's
I'm
what I was
certainly not here to
thinking,
tell you guys what to do, but at some point, when sea level's high enough, there's no way to stop the water from going up the creek and flooding the whole town. So
Yeah.
Thanks for the clarification. Yeah, and on that, just so as we're talking about it, so right, we have behind the Trader Joe's, that's mostly Larkspur, and then kind of toward the end, we've got the Greenbrae Boardwalk, which is County of Marin, and then you go under the freeway, and you're going through Caltrans, and then you continue up, Lucky Drive, and you've got Larkspur and Corte Madera, and so we're definitely aware of that, and we want to include them all in the conversation and see what kind of solutions we can come up with together.
and it's clearly long-term.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. You can't see graphs like this and not at least say we've discussed what kind of solution we should look at in the future. So.
Yeah. And I think, and I'll just put there's, the questions of, again, when do you start doing any of these projects? That's that time question of hitting a threshold. What other policies does the town put into place around redevelopment in these different towns? If you have one or two tents, what is the cost and how do you balance those resources? So I think that those are some of the decisions on a long-term basis. Short term, it's not, we don't have to worry too much as much about that, but just looking at these graphs, what are the both physical and policy questions that need to be answered as a town? Okay, so now this is moving on to transportation. So again, this is at the mid-level, so this is the 3 foot. So these are, again, our overtopping areas here. The red, or the kind of orange, are flooded roadways at that point. And I think you can see these are some of the trails are over here, a little bit of the trails. This is the bikeway, the green is the bikeway.
Is Caltrans studying anything as far as solutions to one-on-one?
That's what we're going to be doing. Oh, is that not? I'm going to get to that in just a second. Okay. Just wanted to quickly say that we have a couple of other relevant projects that are going on at the same time. So this whole thing about how do we keep our data up to date, we are all studying. We have to be continuing our conversations with them because they're learning new things and coming up with solutions. So the Marin County Assessment for Emergency Response with Flooding, San Francisco Estuary Institute, SFEI as it's often called, are doing a shoreline adaptation analysis, atlas, and more analysis on this. And that, I believe, is online right now. And then the Marin County Land Use and Zoning for adaptation. So they're providing other materials that we'll be looking at and cross-referencing and including in our final plan.
And we're certainly coordinating with Marin County, but we also have a scope with San Francisco Estuary Institute to bring some of their modeling and information and look at it specific to the town of Corte Madera.
Yeah. Okay, so let me go into that transportation piece. So based on that map I showed you a second ago, we're looking at helping to create a couple of design-specific strategies for the transportation, and these are areas that we're looking at. They're not picked. RJ will be working with the Nelson Nygaard on figuring out which ones of these, and so there's some that are more fire-focused up here, which are relating to getting in and out. How do you create access? Some of these are footpaths. Can you work with footpaths to have another way of access? Widening of roads, We don't know, they're very narrow up there. So what can we do with those? But then here are all in the flood zone and areas that might be design focused. So, and then like here, this Redwood Highway becomes more of a buffer. You create a buffer to the commercial area, make sure that you have access to commercial and recreation areas. It's a bike route and it's, closest major street to the water. So that's why this one was being looked at here. And then Paradise San Clemente, it's the only access to the Mariner Cove neighborhood. Again, it's a regional bike route and it's another close thing. So obviously it connects here.
So just want to emphasize, so this is part of that required study with the grant funding, and so it doesn't mean we're not going to have discussions about all the vulnerabilities in town, and we know Mariners Cove is certainly an area that is on a lot of people's minds. But I would like to kind of gauge your thoughts on this. I think there's a lot of sense to, if we were to choose 3, Paradise Drive, San Clemente, and Redwood Highway, Warnham, I think where it gets a little more challenging is, whether, what to do with the third, to do a more detailed analysis of what types of concept improvements you could do.
We might also think about and we'll have to talk to Nelson Nygaard about this, but for instance, in the fire areas, there might be the opportunity of creating a design standard and a sort of set of tools that we design it. I'm just going to pick one, the Corte Madera del Prezio, and there's enough of the similar things in the others that the design interventions that work here will also work there. So it's not that you're leaving them out, it's that you're taking one, you're diving deep into it, looking at those strategies to determine what should actually be done. I'm not sure to the same extent what these are because we have freeways versus roads, but that could also be a scenario where we can create some approaches and design solutions that can be applied to the other ones. So it's not just saying we're not going to look at those other ones, it's looking at the ones that are perhaps the most representative that we can get enough information that they can be applied to the other roadways as well. Did you want to add anything else to that, RJ? I was just saying, and
Yeah.
you were out the room, of that the possibility of you have one of the fire ones, it becomes a template almost
Sure.
of design solutions.
Yeah, and I'm obviously want to hear from the rest of the group. I think when it comes to evacuation routes, it's probably Christmas Tree Hill is the most limited, right? Chapman Hill has several access points. And there's also a couple in the Corte Madera area. And then when it comes to, these other ones, it's possible some of the Lucky Drive concepts could be also used in other, bay fronting areas. So that's something else to consider.
I think as far as the fire areas go, I think the neighborhood response groups are doing good work there with the town and with the fire department, and I wouldn't want you guys to waste your resources duplicating what they're doing. I'm on the neighborhood response group for Christmas Tree Hill, and it includes every house on the whole hill. And so we've worked with PG&E and with the fire department, getting stuff as wide as possible, redoing all the paths to get them clear of debris. The people who live near the escape points that are closed and locked know that those are closed and locked for a reason, but many of them might have bolt cutters in their cars. So I think the people up there, it's a dangerous place, but I wouldn't say that this group should necessarily focus on it because there's been a lot of time and effort spent on it, and in Chapman Park as well over the last couple of years.
So how would that information get to the appropriate people, so, you know what I mean, so that can be, I know a friend of mine also lives off of Meadow Suite on Lupine, which is kind of high fire risk, and they have in their own neighborhood, and not a lot of houses up there, but it's the same thing where they just met, and they're taking it upon themselves to trim everything back, and so I imagine there's many more groups like that, but how does that all come together in one repository so that can be relayed to your group or to whomever else would care?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
There's 38 neighborhood response groups that are all organized, and Lori Rice is the paid employee who coordinates all of them. So I think she would be your go-to to talk to her about that. And one of the main issues as far as transportation corridors goes is, what do you do up on Christmas Tree Hill if you're trying to evacuate?
Yeah.
Everyone's like, well, I've got my kit in my car and I jump in my car and go. And then no fire trucks can get up the hill and everybody gets stuck. And the fire trucks will basically knock your car off the hill on the way up if they have to. So that's why we started clearing the footpaths and trying to get everyone who's able-bodied to get down on foot. And so for you to know about those kind of issues and what the police want and what the fire wants, that'd be important coordination.
I do know that Lori has been on our list, and I think we've been talking with her and at least getting information out to the NRGs, but I think it sounds like we need to get input from her about what's actually being planned, and she can maybe give us some more fine detail on what is or is not needed up in these areas. And I think one of the questions was not just always going down. I mean, it seems like the fire would probably come from this way, but also these are other fire roads that are through here. And so how do people know where to go, and how can that be relayed as a communication element too?
Yeah,
and so I'm sure they're talking about it.
Ruben, the fire marshal, recently told us that on those red flag days, the wind is hot and dry, blowing from east to west. So it's probably coming the other way if there's a fire. It's going to be something that starts down here and goes up that hill, and people will need to go over the hill to get away from it. So.
Yeah, there needs to be some sort of communication tool. I mean, and that's part of that adaptation and that we need to do is, what are those signals? If all the cell towers are out, and like that happened in the fire in Sonoma County, radios, blast signals. And I think that's probably having an emergency system for be it water or fire. Yeah.
Already knows all those answers.
2 if by sea and 3 if, 1 if by water. Yeah. So that's, anyway, what we're continuing to work on, and we're going to be refining which one of these makes sense, trying to get as much bang for your buck as possible in terms of the design infrastructure. And again, as RJ said, this doesn't mean that we're not going to identify key adaptation strategies for different areas that are in, I can't go back. Can you just go back, zoom back out? Thanks. That might happen here and other places, but we are trying to look at those major roadways as hardening those to make them stronger for everybody.
And you didn't have it in any of those boxes, the between Wernham and Corte Madera Creek, where the overpass starts, where there's often flooding right there. Maybe that's just a localized
here?
issue. Yeah.
It connects to Lucky, you mean?
Yeah. Well, on the freeway, when you're getting over to Sir Francis Drake, it floods at King Tides.
Yeah.
in the rain.
Is that because it's outside of your town?
So
That's
that's
large
part of
portion.
it.
Yeah, that's
Certainly, we want to share information, and any strategies we come up with, we can, partner and share with them. But that was the primary reason.
Okay.
Okay, so that's really all we have on the update to this point. Did have a couple just questions here and just things that you might want to consider, that we can start to integrate into this. So our current challenges, what really should we be focusing on, or all of the above? The extreme precipitation, is it Mariner's Cove, the marshes? What are the best opportunities to increase preparedness and resilience? And what do we want to see out of this project? And what's most useful for you guys as the Flood Control Board? So I don't know if anyone wants to say anything on any of those. Bob, you look like you might say something here.
Gonna see anybody else have some thoughts on this or questions on this?
And I feel like we've always tried to be responsive to the public's questions or issues, whether it's in Mariner Cove or other neighborhoods where there's persistent flooding. And you guys have done a ton of work highlighting the areas that are the worst flooding areas and methodically going through and putting in new drains or working at 101. So I think in the short-term stuff, we already have a process in place, and we know what our funding is, and we know how much we can do in a year. So I don't think a lot of the first bullet are things that we need from your group, because we're doing that now in short-term. It seems like what we need as a town is more of a medium and long-term planning for what we might do when sea level is a foot higher or 3 feet higher or more. And the day-to-day stuff, I feel like we have a handle on what the small issues are.
And I'm not sure on the extreme precipitation is that's necessarily a short-term issue only. I think the concern is that if you have a certain level of sea level rise, not even, that we could have major rainstorm where we're seeing huge amounts of rain in a short period of time, Corte Madera Creek coming down, and the combination of the two, or a king tide, creates a cascading event that causes major problems. And so that's almost like, okay, that could happen sooner potentially than later. I mean, we're seeing a lot of drought right now and potentially, but those are some of those things that we're looking at. So I'm not sure that's only short term as a concern. Although I hear what you're saying, which is important to know, which is you're doing a lot on stormwater management is your intent.
Like the problems that happen every year are the ones we need to fix now. So.
Right.
Yeah, but I think something Minnie's touching on is just, we have all these flood control systems. They were installed decades ago, and they need a lot of maintenance, whether that's, the pump stations, the pumps, which we do pretty regularly, and that's kind of normal. But, what's the volume and capacity of our lagoons? When was the last time they were dredged? So some of those things that, I couldn't tell you if we have, 30-year flood protection in those systems or 20. We just don't know, and then there would have to be a analysis to figure that out. So at some point through this, that should be ranked as, what priority is that amongst all the other things that we're considering. Certainly they're working, so we're happy, and we have that comfort, but at a certain point we should prepare further and better understand it.
Yeah, understanding those assets and which are there ones that are in worse shape than others? Are there places that we should be focusing as priorities? I think those things are always helpful. There is a lot of money coming out that's from the feds on mitigation and adaptation funding. So, part of this plan can help to set up those funding streams for this kind of infrastructure.
Let me look at the map again, going back.
Yeah. Which one's the best one, Bob?
That one would be okay.
Oh.
Being recorded. And since, this is a transportation grant, then the focus, one of the focuses should be on 101 in particular. And I think that currently 101 is protected by the existing levees. But as we talked about, it's not really protected up towards Corte Madera Creek. But what Nate was talking about was really trying to maintain this levee, the old railroad right-of-way that comes down here and then protects Marina Village. Coming around, and there is a levee that goes all the way up to. No, wait a minute. That's this from here. That's harbor here. So the levee that comes down, comes around the detention pond, comes out here, goes back, and then is right along San Clemente Creek. Here, you don't really see it. This is Mariner Cove 5, and this is the rest of Mariner Cove. But Marina Village in here is protected by the levee that hooks in to this levee going around the detention pond and the old railroad right-of-way. So I think what we need to do is to really try to, in the sort of short to intermediate term, maintain that levee, and when there's material that's available, have a shovel-ready project that we could put that material on the levee. Some of it gets complicated, as we've talked about, because you've got vegetation on potentially both sides with this, even though this is a detention basin. But there was a proposal in 1995 involving Corte Madera, Larkspur, and the county where this levee would be maintained, and as Nate was talking about, it would continue up, and where the trestle starts and the land drops away you would need to continue that, loop that around and bring that over and tie it into the overpass so that it would be tied into the overpass and then come along on the other side and raise the existing levee here that then hooks up along Dougherty Drive. And that would really provide the protection that the Corte Madera needs, you know, from flood waters coming in this way from Corte Madera Creek or high tides around here and coming up through Larkspur. This is the thing that would give us the biggest immediate benefit. I think in the long term, Mariner Cove really needs some protection. I would like to see the possibility of this levee being recreated. It's not very significant right now, but being maintained where you would actually have a tide gate out at San Clemente Creek, and then you'd have to tie into a seawall or some kind of barrier that would then come over to Paradise, which would then protect all of this part of Paradise. But I think that's something that would be more of a long-term solution. But this project almost got done in '95, and there were a couple of people that objected that a seawall was going to block their view, or they didn't want to pay for it. And that's, you know, that was a Marin County project, so that's still around here in the engineering book someplace, because Dave Brackett had pulled that out and showed it to me a number of years ago.
Yeah, I remember on our kayak cruise, Bob, that you mentioned some of the things about the levees was also there were amenities back in the day and people could walk out on them. Yeah. And, you know, that is definitely something communities are doing all over, is if they're building these very expensive seawalls and levee systems, is how do you actually make them also a community benefit? And so creating recreational activities and walking paths, you know, and that's something that we're also charged to think about. So our transportation is not just cars, it's people. And so how do you actually think about this as an integrated multi-benefit project? So, well, I definitely note that, and we know where you are. We know where you live. It can help us with more of that information.
So RJ, you said at the beginning the plan was to have a final plan by late next year, or maybe a little later. What does it mean to be a final plan? Is it going to have to be approved by town council? Will there be periods where there's more public comment? I'm curious, because I think that's something people are going to want to understand is,
Right.
is this a plan that's going to happen? Is it funded, or is this just a vision? What does it mean?
So I think it's twofold. So it's going to be a working document in some sense that, you know, every 5 or 10 years we probably need to update it. But we do want to do a final draft for, you know, the year we complete it, 2020, saying this is going to be our direction for the next 5 or 10 years, and these are the things we're going to prioritize and focus on. And I believe it's going to go to council for final approval.
Okay. I think we just want to be very clear about the things that are in there that are kind of that working document live plan, and the things in there that actually represent budgeted items, and make sure there's no confusion where people think, oh, there's going to be a seawall next year behind my house and I'm going to lose my view. We want to make sure that anything that's in there is communicated and it's clear of what's a possibility and what's in the town's plan, just so nobody gets confused about it.
Yeah, understood. And yeah, you know, as much as we want to be able to get, you know, as good of cost information and constraint information as possible, because we're looking at such big concepts, you know, we're only going to be able to drill down so much as part of this effort.
Yeah.
So there will be some, you know, flexibility, which I think is a good thing. So.
And then the last item is, it's not something we need to decide on or even discuss tonight, but I think the idea of when you're looking at medium and long-term planning, the kind of things that I mentioned and that Bob mentioned, there's the engineering and there's the cost and then there's the permitting. And that could, you know, maybe if we need to do this in 70 years, we need to start permitting today, because those permits are going to be the hardest permits that this town has ever gotten. And so I think starting to think about what it would mean, or if it's totally off the table to touch a marsh, or if in certain circumstances you can, to perhaps look at the long-term plans and look at examples from other places, maybe from Santa Benicia, where there's levees that block everybody's view who are along the creek there, about how that worked and how that got built would be instructive, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's a very accurate and fair point about, building a project like this. It's a 5 to 10 year minimum commitment anytime you're building on the bayfront.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, we should start, I think we have started, and I think it's my goal to actually have some real, concepts that can roll into a project, and we can start having those discussions. And permitting is a huge part of it. It's not that, in this day and age, you can't just build whatever you want. It doesn't matter how much money you have. You have to build what is sensible for the environment, and you have to work through all those constraints. And so, yeah, it will take time, and it'll be a big effort, but I think it's much needed for this town.
Yep.
I think the idea of maintaining the existing levee, most of it does not have that much impact on the environment, because they're either wetlands only on one side, and so you have room to expand the footprint on the other. Where it gets a little dicier is around the detention pond, and if the BCDC or Corps of Engineers is going to complain that there's wetland vegetation in the detention pond, then that makes it difficult. But a lot of the levee enhancement or building up the levee, I think, could be done without really impacting the environment or impacting the marshes.
Yeah, I mean, I think any project that is adding fill or doing any even temporary wetland impacts, it's going to be a long permitting process, but that's okay. I mean, that's why we're here. That's why we're talking now. And I think, yeah, if we can come up with some immediate goals and start that process, and we could have a project where it's cleared environmentally, but then it gets rolled out as, like you said, Bob, materials are available, or as funding's available. But at least having the concept cleared from environmental compliance perspective would be a big step in that direction.
And we do have on our Resiliency Advisory Committee someone who's a rep from PCDC, and who was very involved with the adapting to rising tides. So we have a number of people who are from the county and Larkspur, and so we have some good folks who hopefully will guide us as we go through this process. But we'll be talking to them a little later in November, having some of the similar conversations, and so even getting more down to the nitty-gritty about what we should be doing. So hopefully they'll be able to be part of our advisory crew on that.
Mindy, if you could go to your last slide, the discussion points.
Yeah.
So, just for the record, I know Mariner Cove's the bigger one, but I assume you're not forgetting Marina Village. Because that was the one that has the most, according to your pictures, the most vulnerability. In terms of the second main bullet, opportunities for preparedness,
Let me just, before you go on, let me just ask a quick question. I would maybe another way, instead of calling it a neighborhood, I mean, it's maybe saying the residents on the waterfront. I mean, is that a better way of talking about it rather than calling it out as a neighborhood? Or do you think calling it as a neighborhood is appropriate?
Didn't we call it a flood zone? Didn't you number it a flood zone?
Well, no, the flood zone is determined just on your elevation and doesn't take into account what's protecting it. And so Marina Village is part of this levee system. It's part of the existing levee system. And if that wasn't in place, it would be flooded now. And so that's why it's critical to maintain the part of the levee going around Marina Village, as well as the rest of the levee going north.
Yeah.
Mariner Cove is separate because we're not protected by a levee. And people have brought, some fill into their backyards and done what they can to keep the water from coming between the houses and getting into the streets. And then the town has put these check valves in to keep the tides from backing up. So that's a short-term solution. And the longer-term solution is going to be much more complicated. maybe the permitting will get easier 10, 20 years from now when we see the magnitude of the problem. But, you know, that's the really tough one to deal with is Mariner Cove.
So I guess the question is, in terms of like if I'm talking to the community as a whole, do we talk about them both as obviously, hopefully not either or? Do we talk about them as those areas? I mean, I'm just curious how you think it's most appropriate. Are they seriously? We should consider them as two different neighborhoods, and they're two different. It sounds like they're two different solution sets completely.
Yeah, the Marina Village had problems with ponding that's largely been addressed with the slot drains that have put in, but they're not really subject to tidal flooding. The drainage goes into this sort of small marsh to the north of Marina Village. And so as long as the levees are intact, Marina Village is okay. Now, it may be that there'll be so much settlement at time, we may need to have a pump station to get the stormwater out into this other little receptive marsh that accommodates that.
So that's probably why my colleague put Mariner's Cove up here, is that it doesn't have that protection as this point. So
It's much more exposed
As a
all
short-term
the way
thing.
around the
Okay.
outskirts of the neighborhood.
but we won't forget it, David.
Yeah.
It was good to have that clarification.
Just to kind of reiterate, you know, I think there's some prior studies and solutions that are already, at least at conceptual phase for Marina Village, that could be taken further. Mariner's Cove is the bigger puzzle of the two.
All right, David, sorry, I wanted to get that one thing, and you had your next question on opportunities.
Yes, and I think might be come up later is the newsletter. So we can defer that. And then the third bullet, I would say, it's been addressed by Nathan, is kind of the timeline. Please keep us informed on your major milestones and goals.
Yeah, absolutely. As a member of the Mariner Cove area, I know that that's the number one question I'm getting is, especially as we get into this rainy season, what are we doing? And so it's nice just to be able to have information at my fingertips for that timeline.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think, definitely the plan would be to have, another check-in once we have enough information with the flood control board, make sure you guys are, even though I'm sure most of you all attend the various public outreach events, but make sure we come back here to this setting to have a dialogue.
Yeah. And we do have this website, and so I think working with you, RJ, to figure out what of this material we want. Some of the stuff I feel is better to talk through than just throw out. And so what is the best to just share without a conversation versus having that conversation and sharing that in a dialogue. So just how do we make sure people get the information it's not too scary or they're too vague. And that's why we want to vet it through you and through the RAC to make sure that we're giving good information that's clear. But we do have that website to share out to the rest of the community to keep us updated. We can use that more.
Mindy, what are your thoughts in relationship to this marshes and detention ponds along Redwood Highway? Are you talking about just the existing marshes and the existing detention pond?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's certainly been a big part of our flood protection system.
Yeah. I mean, I'm getting the sense that it's kind of all of the above. There isn't one that we can just say, oh, we're just going to talk about that one because they're all sort of interacting systems. Is that accurate?
Yes. The bigger long-term challenge to the marshes, as we talked about kayaking, was protection from storm surges and ferry wake and ship wake, because the berms or levees that used to be out there on the outside of those have largely washed away at this point, and the marsh is being eroded at an alarming rate. But this is a challenge that goes way beyond Corte Madera, Larkspur, and the County of Marin, because this is something that's really a benefit to the Bay and all communities on the Bay. And at some point, we're going to have to come up with some solution to prevent the further erosion or total erosion of the wetlands. They do function somewhat as a horizontal levee to keep down storm surges
Yeah.
and run-up. But unless we can find some plans and funding to harden the outer edges or bring some dredge spoils in to build that up, we're going to lose them.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think that's our regional
That's
thing.
almost long-term from the standpoint that that's a huge,
Yeah.
huge challenge.
Well, and I think as all those other projects that are going on concurrently, and we think about this coastline of Marin County, there's so much stuff that has to be evaluated, and a lot of this stuff is regional. It's not just one solution that I can fix this one levee and it's all good, because this water is going to go everywhere, and so we have to really do a concerted effort to connect these to other efforts.
And if you haven't already, around the issue Bob's talking about and
Yeah.
making sure we're not losing marsh that we already have,
Yeah.
the engineer at County of Marin, Chris Chu, they've been working on modeling for depositing dredge spoils underwater in certain areas where, for instance, Corte Madera Creek would bring a lot of winter sediment out. And if you put dredge spoils angled in certain ways, it would help drop all that sediment locally instead of flushing it out to sea. I know the county's working on ways to keep sediment local and keep it from getting flushed.
Yeah.
Yeah, Roger Leventhal at the county has been very creative. I even saw a demonstration of they catapulted dredge spoils into a marsh to try to
Catapulted.
try to build that up.
Wow. All right. That's quite an event. Any other thoughts or things that you guys would want to see out of this? Okay. Well, I think that's it I have.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mindy.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mindy. Thanks for all the work you've been doing on that. All right, staff update.
Yes. All right, 1 second, please. Okay, one of, I think the requests from Chair Bundy was to get some information and a little update on the High Canal Embankment Repair Project. So we are substantially complete with that project, and I thought it'd be a good time to just walk you through some of the steps that we had to take. On the permitting discussion. This itty bitty small repair project kind of gives you a little taste of what it could be on a much larger scale. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with the repair sites, but here you've got High Canal, and this is the portion that is gravel, so just south of the pedestrian bridge there at Sandra Marker Trail. So this is what the slope failures look like. This was last year. We had to cover it with visqueen just to kind of protect it during the winter, and then here are a few others closer to the pedestrian bridge that we're not exactly sure when they fill, but as we were doing this project, we figured this would be a good time to address those as well. So spring of 2018, we attended the Marin Project Coordination Meeting, which is a gathering by a number of resource permitting agency groups, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Regional Water Quality Control Board, Army Corps, Marin Resource District, so several others, and gated some kind of initial thoughts on the project and what permits were applicable and what constraints we might have to get through in order to get permits for the project. We initiated design summer of last year. That involved a contract with BKF Engineers for some survey work, Miller Pacific for geotechnical, and then as part of a lot of this analysis of different repairs, they want to see hydraulic calculations to prove that your concept is the most bioengineered as possible. So that was the initial set of contracts there. All in all, I think they weren't large in dollar, altogether. I think those were around $20,000 or $25,000. Fall of fall of 18. Yeah, developed the concept design because, and actually I'll jump ahead and then I'll come back. This was kind of the, determine the best concept design where you have a rock riprap buttress on the lower part of the repair, and then you have a compacted soil above it with native seeds and also some additional plantings. So when we first brought this to the resource agencies, they said, well, you're putting in riprap, whereas before you had kind of more of a native soil and plants, and so that became something we had to mitigate for. Above it was primarily ice plant, but even so, they wanted kind of a robust revegetation and mitigation plan. So going back here, so we then brought on WA, which is an environmental local firm, and they helped us prepare a JARPA, which is the Joint Aquatic Resource Permit application. We determined we needed permits from California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Regional Water Quality Control Board, and the Army Corps. And then as part of that, this revegetated mitigation plan. So although the 4 repairs were kind of spread out over, say, 400 feet, we ended up replanting and kind of revegetating the whole upper bank from, that whole 400-foot stretch, and I'll show that in a photo later. Took several submittals of the JARPA to get a complete application, and we got final permits just in time to build the project in the environmental window that we were allowed, which was September 1 to October 15th. As part of that plan, we had to also figure out a way to create a cofferdam to delineate the repairs from the high canal drainage. So we decided to go with these linear sandbag cofferdams, and that's kind of the red line you see there dashed. And then here's kind of a more detailed view of what exactly that entails. So you're here working on the slope, and then we would place sandbags in the creek, wrap them in visqueen so that it's sealed off from the water, and then we did a large fish relocation effort and dewatering of the work zone prior to any heavy digging over there. Prior to doing that, we also set up fish screens so that try to minimize any fish or other aquatic species from entering the work zone as the sandbags are being placed. So here's kind of what it looks like in real life. So we've got the contractor plus several biologists on the scene as they're drawing the water down, and they're going and scooping fish and anything live they see until the very, very end. Once the water's all the way down, then they finally sign off and say that it's okay for construction. And they report all the species they find, and they relocate them to the nearest safe spot. I believe they went further down the creek. So here's kind of what the repair looks like if you go out there today. So here's one of the larger repairs, and then there's a few down here. This used to be all ice plant, but we stripped it and planted it with native seeds and this core mat, which is a pretty durable product, but it's also biodegradable. And then the only thing we're holding off on is we're planning to do a bunch of plantings in here, but we want to time it with a little more rain. If we were to plant it when the contractor was ready 3 or 4 weeks ago, then they might not be doing so well right now. So as soon as we see some rain on the forecast, we'll go and do that last step. But otherwise, it's complete. Complete in the sense of the physical work, and then we also, as part of that revegetation and monitoring plan, we'll have to go there, analyze the plants on a yearly basis, report on it, and ensure a certain level of survivability of the plants over a 5-year period.
Good work.
Yeah, thank you.
What was the ballpark of the total cost?
It was close. So the construction contract came in right around $250, if I recall, and then we the mitigation monitoring plan was another 40 or so, and then once you kind of lump in all the other factors, it was close to 400.
Who got the contract?
So this was Major and Gelati out of Sanderfeld.
Gelati.
Yeah.
So was there any material that was moved off-site, or was it all held and then used for this compacted soil underneath the jute?
So the the more clay soils were taken off site, where the riprap is there now. But all the stuff on the upper areas was reused. Yeah.
So around the permitting, you said you went to the state, CDFW, and Water Board and Army Corps. There's either a change has been made or there's a proposed change for defining navigable waters for Army Corps involvement. So I think after that change, we would want to look at whether or not there is even a federal nexus for work like this in the future. We might not have to get feds involved after that change is in place. And that's just one less major agency to deal with.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that one. I know Corte Madera Creek is a Army Corps navigatable water.
Yeah.
And so if the concept of
The change,
the levee there, that would be a definitely a discussion.
Yeah, the
that they
change
would-
was specifically around smaller waterways that feed into navigable waters.
Okay.
And when Obama became president, they changed the rules so that every feeder stream of every navigable water was now under the Army Corps' jurisdiction, and that's either been turned back or is about to be turned back. So it might pull everything besides Corte Madera Creek out of Army Corps jurisdiction. So
Interesting.
be good to check next
Yeah.
time, and don't send them anything if we don't have to.
Right. Something on this one that was interesting. This is a man-made facility, right? This is, this was developed as part of our flood control system, and so, depending on which environmental company's interpretation, some didn't think that,
Right.
we needed permits from all the agencies that we did, but, we inquired and we asked, and they said yes. Whether we could have
Yeah.
pushed back harder, it's unclear.
I'm not
but
sure it had even taken effect yet,
Yeah.
but a lot of the push was from farmers whose irrigation canals became under Army Corps jurisdiction. So, this is an artificial canal like a irrigation canal, so it's possible that
Yeah.
this would be pulled out of that realm.
Mhm. Yeah, and another positive note about the project is, sorry, we had thought that this might take as many as 6 weeks worth of in-creek work. Kind of set up the cofferdam, dewater, 2 weeks of digging, and then move to the next spot and do that 3 times. And the contractor was pretty aggressive, and they delivered, and they got all the in-creek work done in about 2 weeks. So,
That's great.
yeah.
And you said that's all native fill? Not structure?
So the riprap is from Dietrich Sam Fell, but then all the portion above that is reusing native
That's great.
material. Yeah. Yep. So, any more questions?
Could we have taken that clay off and used it on the levees? That's my question.
I knew it was coming.
We need to develop that compliance document so we can start having those discussions. All right, moving on. So the last item we have is to talk a little bit about some progress we made here on the on-ramp at Tamalpais at 101. And I'll let Chris kick off this part of the discussion.
So as you know, we've had some drainage issues with water during storm events encroaching in the road. And we approached Caltrans about a month ago to dig some of the shoulder out and try and increase the drainage along there. And they actually responded within a few weeks, which in my experience is really fast for Caltrans. So they went all the way basically along that whole green line and dug a drainage channel, filtering the water towards the freeway and where it enters a catch basin goes under the freeway. And so RJ and I went out there and used a laser level and just checked. We went as far out as we felt safe doing without going on the freeway. But there is now positive drainage going along the mall heading north. It's not a lot. I believe it was 0.6%. And just to give you an idea, when you do concrete work, 0.5% is usually the minimum you want to do to get positive drainage. But in an earthen swale, that's less than ideal. But, when you have a lot of water, it'll at least float in the right direction. So it should improve the conditions out there.
So it goes underneath the freeway to the ditch on the other side, where it then goes down and then drains back underneath the freeway to Shorebird Marsh.
I believe so, yeah. It goes to a pump station eventually and then gets pumped back out.
Yeah, so I think you're right, Bob. There, we can see the head wall here, and then it crosses over to another ditch. And I believe you're right, it goes back under, it goes the other direction.
Yeah, there's that box culvert that's right at the near the pond at the Corte Madera Inn.
Right.
And it's gravity drainage back into Shorebird Marsh at that point. And then, of course, the pump stations at Shorebird Marsh manage the levels if the tides don't accommodate us.
Mm-hmm. And something we'll touch on a little more in a second, but yeah, with that pipe, that's kind of our, we're kind of fixed elevation there, so that's, it's not a easy feat to drop that pipe deeper in the ground and then re-dig that, that ditch and then drop that other pipe. So we're kind of stuck with what we have at that pipe, and then it's a matter of, what can we do on this end.
Yeah. No, that's really great. I thought it would have to go drain, back sort of east into some of the drains that take it into the Shorebird Channel Marsh there. So nice work on getting them to do that. At least they had their equipment out there as they were doing, this metering plan on that. RJ had the tough job. He had to work with them without doing anything, and then get Corte Madera to take it on the off ramp
Right.
from 101, which really worked well.
Yeah, he gets all the credit on this one. I just joined in the last second. But here's some pictures of what we saw when we were out there, and you can just see they've dug a channel there along the fence.
Great.
Yeah, so they've committed to, going out there. They got pulled aside with all the, the high winds and the shutdowns for the power, but we had plans to go out there and take some level shots looking that way. We didn't want to go any further because that's, it's starting to get pretty close to the freeway, but you can see here, they did create, a good amount of capacity. That's
Yeah.
That's a, 1.5 deep ditch with positive flow from the roadway. So I think that's, I don't know, it must have been several years before they had done that last, so I think that's a good step.
Decades.
Decades, there you go, all right. And then, yeah, we'll go out there, we'll put some elevations to it, see what kind of further improvements we can make.
Did you talk him into an annual maintenance program?
So I actually met, I want to say, 3 of the 4 people on the crew that manage all of Marin, Sonoma, and the Richmond Bridge. They literally have like the amount of guys that can fit on my hand.
Yeah.
So,
Wow.
but so far they've been great to work with, and so I want to give them all that credit, and hopefully we can continue to partner with them, and if this gets worse, then yeah, come up with some ideas.
Can we touch it, or
What's that?
can the town touch this if there's a little bit of, if there's dirt or stuff running into there, or there's vegetation growing? Can we
Yeah.
spend resources to clear it, or do they
so-
have to do it?
At a minimum, there would be an encroachment permit involved, and those are, pretty challenging to get with Caltrans. But then they also have I'm sure they have a maintenance agreement that speaks to their vegetation management and any potential wetland species, and it only gets more complicated. So I just don't think we want to go there.
Okay.
And especially if they're responding, the way they have been, the last year or so.
But that really was a safety hazard in those heavy rains. It just encroached out on the road, and one wheel would be in a couple inches of water, and there were some real safety issues with that, and it was also particularly bad, come exiting the freeway as you were going north, and if you weren't prepared for it, all of a sudden you had a spray of water came on your car. Your windshield wipers weren't going, and surprised there weren't accidents from that. So this is great. I think we've got some good results out of Caltrans. Nice going.
Yeah, and I think the next step will be just to monitor this winter and just see how it does. And if we can get some pictures of it encroaching the road again, then that helps us even more push Caltrans and get some action.
Yeah, because I can imagine, this isn't the only place where they have water encroaching on roadways, but if it's, so I think there's a big difference from a safety perspective if it's in the road shoulder during, high rain events versus in the actual travel way.
Yeah.
And so if anyone's passing through and happens to capture it while it's in the travel way, that's a much more compelling thing to show them to kind of come up with some ideas. And I think I was kind of touching on it earlier because the that invert that crosses under the freeway is pretty much fixed in elevation. One idea would be building it up as you go back toward Tamalpais and trying to raise grade, but even that would be a fairly sizable project.
Let's keep our fingers crossed.
RJ,
Hope this works.
Yeah,
this isn't a part of the metering project that they're doing?
No. So this was completely separate. We saw remnants of some of the stuff they're working on, but yeah, completely different.
If the guys you met are also in charge of Highway 37 flooding, then this is probably not going to be a big priority for them.
Right. All right. We'll take a look at the further portions here with the maintenance crews with the Caltrans maintenance crew once we get them out there, and really understand how much change in elevation we have as we get closer to that culvert that goes under the freeway. Great. So unless you have any other questions on that item, that's the last item we have for tonight.
Is there an update on the newsletter?
No, we don't have an update on the newsletter for this meeting. We can add that to next meeting.
Okay. I mean, because usually I thought we sent it out in the fall before the rain started to remind people, keep the drains clear.
So
don't throw
are we
things
talking
in the
about
creek.
so we brought the newsletter last meeting
Yeah.
for your review, and we incorporated the bulk of those comments, and that went out.
Oh, that's gone out?
Yeah.
I wonder if you could get on the reader board something about sweeping storm drains or sweeping gutters. And I do it in front of my house, try to do it slowly, and spend a lot of time out there so people see me sweeping up leaves. But
Yeah.
Any day now it's going to start coming and clogging everything up. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, with the new reader board, that's easy to add something to that.
Yeah, we're open to suggestions and also open to any other future agenda items you want to discuss.
Yeah, maybe we could talk about that next time. I mean, we've talked about the, getting neighborhoods or individuals to adopt a drain in front of their house so they keep it swept out, and maybe we can enhance that. Thank you.
Great.
Any other future agenda items? Okay. Meeting adjourned.
All right.